My name is Paul Watanabe. I'm a professor of political science and director of the Institute for Asian American Studies at UMass Boston.
Tell us what's happening with Boston's Chinatown.
Well, it's been for about almost a year exactly now since the coronavirus began to spread as a concern within the United States. Chinatown was probably the most hardest hit earliest and most hardest hit economically and by spirit as well, the neighborhood of Boston. And it's because of its connection, allegedly, with the fact that Wuhan, China was an area in which it identified the virus had spread from. And immediately, therefore, from lots of people, correctly and incorrectly in some degree, they demonized China. They demonized China as a source of the virus. And of course, quickly in Americans' mind, to a considerable degree, they demonized people who trace their ancestry to China. And they could be small children who had never been to China. They could be elders who've never been to China in years and generations. It didn't matter for Americans if you happened to be China. The China connection was considered key. And it led initially in Boston's Chinatown to an almost emptying out of the area of town. That is, the small businesses like nail salons and hair salons and the restaurants and the small bakeries and so forth almost cleared out almost entirely early on during the crisis. So it was the hardest hit area because of this connection between allegedly this phony connection, I would argue. But the way in which from the president of the United States on down, they kept on insisting it would be called the China virus, the Wuhan virus, the Kung Fu virus, all these sorts of terminology that put in certain people's minds, unfortunately, the notion that Chinese were some way responsible for the crisis.
So here we are a year later, and I don't know if you know of Jackie Church. She, for years, hosted food and culture tours in Boston's Chinatown, and she gave us a tour last night. And a lot of the businesses were dark and had gone out of business. And she mentioned that they're facing what she would call a triple pandemic. So they're dealing with the restrictions from the coronavirus, not bringing in students, conventions, or the workforce that used to populate downtown. She also talked about the real estate developments that's kind of like squeezing out the neighborhood businesses and people who live there because rent prices are sky high. And then the racism and the xenophobia that Asian Americans are experiencing. Can you speak to that?
Well, she's right in terms of all these threats, and many of them are accompanying the COVID crisis. Many of them predate it and have continued and have been a part of the scene within Chinatown. In Boston's Chinatown, which has been there for almost 150 years. It's not just this new area, right by South Station, essentially, is where it's been. And Boston's Chinatown is interesting. It's a real Chinatown in the sense it's a Chinatown not only in terms of the facades, the restaurants, the signage, and so forth, but it actually has Chinese people living there. It's a neighborhood, and people call it home, and many of them are elderly. So that creates another double threat to that population because it's an elderly population in a congested part of the town where their environmental impacts to their health are even already exacerbated to a considerable degree. No one can go in the Chinatown area and not notice, for example, that the Massachusetts Turnpike extension cuts right through the middle of Chinatown, divides it almost in half. And that the main streets, the ramps onto the expressways and so forth run right by Chinatown and so forth. It's a congested area. And this is a part of what she was talking about. It's always been a target of developers and so forth, both positive, one might say, in terms of people who want to build high rises and expensive apartments and condos there. But it's not that long ago that it was always an area when Boston decided to relocate its combat zone, its adult neighborhood district. It also chose to put it right next to Chinatown there on Lower Washington Street. So it's always been a target for developers and so forth, and much of the struggle by the people who care about Chinatown, which means many community-based organizations and activists, has been trying to preserve Chinatown as a neighborhood where people live. They should thrive, and they should be successful, both in their health, their mental health, and in terms of their physical health. And their mental and physical health has been a problem in terms of the racism that is mentioned as well. Racism has always accompanied Asian Americans and people of color in the United States. But this pandemic has taken it to a particular level where I think the level of stress is significant amongst the elderly population, amongst school kids, amongst everybody. And I think it's an unseen and unappreciated the extent to which it's had an impact on that population. Many elders, for example, are afraid to go out on the streets because they've seen pictures, for example, from New York and other parts of the country. And we even had some reports recently here around the Boston area where elderly Asian Americans have been attacked. So if you're thinking about the fear of going out and walking down the street without being attacked like that, that's a concern. If your school-age kids are reported being bullied by other kids when the schools were open early on, as early as February of last year, school kids were reporting being bullied by other students, getting blamed for this COVID-19 situation and being picked upon. That has occurred amongst the youngest of kids. And of course, it's everything in between has been impacted as well. So that's another part of this crisis. It wasn't invented, the anti-Asian racism wasn't invented by the crisis, but it certainly, as many things have we've understood in terms of race, this crisis has exposed them. And it's exposed that deep and dirty underside, I think, of American history and American attitudes towards this population.
Is there a running tally? Is anyone keeping track of what's being lost here? I reached out to the Boston Planning and Development Agency,
Yeah.
and there really isn't a directory that shows you pre-pandemic, this is how Chinatown was thriving. And, as we tried to get out of this pandemic, where is it headed? Are you aware of any literature or
I
statistics?
am not, and there's a lot of anecdotal information. And as you see, your eye, if you walk through Chinatown, can tell you the story. You see boarded up restaurants, for example. And even those that are open, many of the most popular ones report 80% losses in terms of revenue. They're barely getting by. Restaurants that used to be thriving places during lunchtime or during the early morning place where Boston's Chinatown used to be a destination after the clubs closed and so forth. Many of these people are serving maybe 10 takeout lunches or meals a day, and it's been fully reported. And as you pointed out, many of the restaurants, for example, in Boston, Chinatown, large Chinese banquets and weddings and so forth are something that they thrive upon. Clearly, all of that is out the window as well. So the impact just on the restaurants and food industry alone has been terrific and been terrible. And the question is that like a lot of other small businesses, there's supposed to be all kinds of government programs to help assist those small businesses. But one thing we found is many immigrant businesses, particularly like the Chinese businesses and Asian American businesses in there and other parts of the city like Fields Corner and Alston Brighton, they suffer because when these announcements first come out, they're always in English and maybe in Spanish. And by the time they decide to get around and make them in Chinese or Vietnamese, all the money's gone. And secondly, if you notice, the government programs are providing assistance to small businesses. They ask the businesses to work through their regular banks in terms of trying to process those loans. Many Asian American businesses don't rely on banks for the normal sort of mainstream process for being capitalized. They don't go to normal banks. They raise money within their family members, or even neighbors sort of get their money together and pool it together and capitalize these. So they don't have relationships with regular banks and so forth. So they don't have that particular conduit. And then many of these individuals are working, many of them in the underground economy and so forth. And they're not the kind of people who are going to go show up in an unemployment office. Many of those people, when they lose their job, just simply leave the workforce, maybe go to school or something like that, or simply leave, and they don't show up as a statistic as being part of the workforce that's been reduced as well. So much of this economic impact is hidden, but you don't even have to look at the hidden aspects. As you pointed out, you can see the real aspects of it. If you take a camera crew, as you probably have, and walk through the streets of Boston, you can see place after place that's boarded up. And even those places that are open, if you go and look at those restaurants, you'll see table after table, maybe one or two diners in them. That's a sign of the impact on the neighborhood. And the health impacts on the neighborhood are also terrific. In those high rises that stand behind or above those those restaurants and little stores on the first floor, is a dense neighborhood of Boston, perhaps in terms of the population, one of the densest neighborhoods, entire Boston, in terms of where people live. And if you look at those places, those people are potentially suffering as well because of the health impacts of this crisis. So it's an area that has always been under attack, as you indicated. Its very survival has been under attack by large institutional forces. It didn't need, and it does not need, this additional burden of having the COVID crisis being unfairly foisted upon them in people's minds, and it's having this impact that I think is dreadful. And I hope we pay some attention to it in addition to all the other racial impacts, which are very real within the city and disparities that occur there.
I was surprised to learn that Boston's Chinatown is the third largest in the country. And in speaking with Jackie, she mentioned the Chinatown in DC and how
Yeah,
it's only a gate and a T-Mobile store and a Starbucks.
that's
Are
right.
you concerned that that could be the fate of Boston's Chinatown?
It could, and that's what the activism has been here for decades, is to try to prevent that. You're absolutely right. I talk about the Washington Chinatown as a Chinatown without any Chinese in it. It has all the paraphernalia, it has all the trinkets, it has all it has a gate, it has signage and so forth, but there's not any real people who live there who are Chinese. It's not a neighborhood that people call home. Boston's Chinatown is a neighborhood people call home. It's just like people call Beacon Hill a home, or Back Bay the home, or Dorchester, or Roxbury, Mattapan a home. Chinatown is a home to people. And it's those people that the survival of which is often gets forgotten. And I want people to focus on that aspect of, as I said, look above and beyond the street level stores and so forth, which are suffering. And they employ many of those people who live there. But there are people suffering behind those places as well. And that should be our attention. And those are the people whose lives we want to preserve. That's the Chinatown that's most important to preserve, is that the people who call it home, just like we would like to, if we saw large institutional factors like highways running through the middle of Wellesley, for example, or Beacon Hill or other neighborhoods of Boston, there'd be such an uproar. But we seem to accept the notion that they're running through this area of town because we think of, oh, it's only small businesses, it's not people who live there. Well, people do call it home, and it has that same impact. And when we drive large cars and build highways through that, the environmental impacts on this population are huge, and we should understand those impacts as well. And there are people who are fighting to preserve its understanding to people that it is a neighborhood, and we should treat it like a neighborhood where people call home. And we should let it thrive. We should be proud of the fact that it is a Chinatown. It is one of the largest in the country, and it's a real Chinatown. It's a real Chinatown in terms of businesses, and it's a real Chinatown in terms of people. And that's a wonderful mix for a place like Boston. It prides itself on this diversity.
And lastly, I understand from my conversations with several, community activists and now yourself, that obviously there's a disconnect between government resources and getting it to the people who need it most, and the businesses and enterprises that need it to continue to survive. But what can regular people do to support Chinatown to make sure that it thrives once we get up once we get up out of this?
Well, everybody used to think about Chinese food in a one sense as a place where people go out to take out food, and that seems to be a very popular phenomenon, at least. Well, going and sitting in a restaurant might consider that some people create problems for them. Takeout food is something that the Chinese are well known for and have perfected for many, many years. We should think about Chinatown as a destination where we can go and pick up food, for example, and utilize and support those restaurants. This is something that's being talked about throughout the city. And I know there's a particular initiative, and a welcome one, to support Black restaurants and Black businesses in this way. We think about doing that as well for businesses like those in Chinatown and other areas of town. And for things like the Latino businesses in places like Chelsea and so forth and other parts of the city. And we should try to support all these entities that are suffering so much in inequitable ways because of the crisis. And I think that's one way we can do. We can try to provide the kinds of clientele that got scared away, and I think unreasonably, can come back to these towns and show their faith and their willingness to support them. And I think that would have a major impact on both, as I say, the bottom line, but the spirit of Chinatown as well. And the spirit of Chinatown is something that we want to have endure as well, not just the physical reality of it, but the fact that we should know that this is a town that has 10% Asian American population, a large we have 170,000 people of Chinese descent within the state. And we should be proud of the fact that we can welcome them in a place like Chinatown and these other Chinatowns that have grown in places like Quincy and Malden and so forth. This is a rich contribution. We should treat it as such and want to support them as such.